Welcome. Today we're going to be focusing on the Mangrove Lagoon tank. It's been through a ton of changes since our last aquascaping video in March, so I'm super excited to show you guys all the updates on this thing. Before we get into today's update though, let me give you an idea of how the tank's been running from March till now in August. It ran without any additions until mid-April when I actually homed a reef tank underneath in the 40 breeder sump. This rock and coral was from a friend who needed to rehome their tank in an emergency. Unfortunately, it did have some bubble algae and aptasia, but none is in the display tank yet. Actually, there is one aptasia, but it came in on one of the orange sponges. I added a peppermint shrimp right next to it, but it hasn't eaten the anemone yet, so we'll see. In mid-April, I also added an ORA Splendid Dotty back to the tank. I'd gotten it in a live aquaria order with the intention of reselling it, but had to keep it when I saw it. It was just too cool. There were no lights on the display until early July when the corals, algae, and sponges were added. The mangroves have been simmering in the fish system refugium, and I just added them to this tank when lights were turned on. Some mixed snails and crabs were also added in about mid-July. Now let's talk about how the tank is doing today. The sun on this tank is an ATI 4-foot 4-bulb fixture. For the first 4 weeks, I ran it with only 2 of the bulbs and then plugged the other 2 in after, just to let the tank acclimate to higher lighting. Once the second 2 were plugged in, the algae really started growing more in the tank though. The only flow in this tank is coming from the Kedsum 770 gallon per hour return pump that is supplying the aquarium from the sump. Usually I put valves on these to restrict the flow and quiet the overflow down some, but in this case I didn't want to add any extra power heads in the tank that just might distract from the aquascape. So I let the return pump just run faster. It's a little bit louder going down the overflow, but it provides just enough flow to the tank for a nice softy tank. Let's talk coral. After having envisioned the tank in its final form and rearranging it in my mind a bunch of times, I came in one evening and planted all the corals. Most of them I broke off their frag plug or just cut the shaft off of the frag plug. Then I super glued them in place. The Accordias I did not super glue though, I just kind of set them where I wanted them to stay, but they managed to attach after a couple weeks. My vision for the tank is that the leather on the left will grow up and connect onto the adjacent rock. It will then grow and fill that whole corner of the tank and reach to the top of the water, trying to come out of the water. The orange Leptoceras will be filling whatever the leather is not shading out on that shelf. There will be a zoanthid garden on the front rocks with a Recordia garden on the ramp right behind that. The mangroves will shade out all around themselves, at least a foot probably, and I'll add another light if necessary to grow them away from the tank. The frog spawns are probably going to be taken out pretty soon. I might replace them, but they just don't fit the look of the tank that I'm looking for. There is a cabbage leather sitting at the base of the ramp that should fill that spot nicely as it grows out. The right pillar rock has about 6 to 8 zoanthid frags glued on it in different places. And there's 2 orange sponges in the shade on the back side of that pillar rock. On the back side of the tank, there's a few leathers, and I hope to add 1 or 2 more toadstool leather coral frags to the back here. That just about does it for the coral plan. Let's talk about what they get fed. The corals get fed 6 days a week. This tank gets Reef Energy, Julian Sprung spirulina powder, and a pinch of some reefroids. Just a splash from the jar goes in this tank as we feed all of the other coral tanks here. This tank doesn't require very much in the way of fish feeding. It either gets the NLS Nature Ox Flakes daily or just a couple PE mysis shrimp. There's only the one dotty back for now, so the food need's pretty low. I acclimated and added 3 blue leg hermits, 2 ninja star snails, 4 Necarius, 3 ceriths, and a turbo snail in here. In future tank builds, I'm going to add the inverts a couple weeks before the lights turn on. These were added after algae had already started growing. One ninja star was found on the ground next to the tank this morning. It must have jumped overboard last night. We also got these 2 orange sponges and some dragon's tongue algae from above Seahorse Reef in Cross City, Florida. The 40 breeder sump is composed of 3 portions with no dividers. There is a horizontal drain on the right side of the tank. The middle is a Chaetomorpha refugium, and the left side closest to the overflow box is the return pump. The return pump has some live rock around it to protect from loose chaeto, but it really never gets covered much actually. The refugium was just set up in the last couple weeks. Let's talk about this overflow cover and the rocks I built up on top of it. I actually bought a 3D printer so I could print overflow covers. Overflow boxes are all unique and fish are constantly jumping into our customers' overflows. There's a certain neon dottyback and a certain clownfish that I've scooped out of overflows more times than I can count. This print took about 8 hours and I already printed one for my other 60 gallon. The overflow cover is pretty sturdy, but I'm concerned about its long-term durability. As long as it's not making direct contact with the salt water, it should last at least a year or 2 though. After I had this nice cover, I always had dreams of covering the overflow with more rocks that were jutting out of the water. Luckily, I had these Stax rocks to choose from that are shaved off on one side. I think they're from Julian Sprung as well. I never thought I'd find a good use for this piece as it's so unnaturally shaped, but it works perfectly on this overflow cover. Since setting up the refugium and seeing that the Chaetomorpha seems to be growing, I'm confident the algae in this tank will die back soon. The refugium, coupled with the inverts and 2 water changes a month, will knock it back in no time. Please give me some fish recommendations for this tank. It's going to be all aquacultured fish in here, I decided. And aside from a splendid dottyback, I'm also looking at a mandarin and Aptasia eating filefish. Also thinking about adding some more planted algae or another soft coral where the frog spawns currently are. So give me your thoughts. That's it for the update on this one. There's a lot more tanks to make updates on. The 14 Peninsula looks totally different and has really come into its own. We should be making updates on this mangrove tank at least every 4 to 6 months from here on out.